Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to St. Andrew's and our Faith and series. This series was dreamed up several years ago as a way of trying to make sense of our life through the lens of faith, but how it intersects with daily living. And so you could say this is faith and ethics. You know, if you know a good sports person, we'd love to have sports, faith and sports, or faith and. But we're trying to ask the big questions about how we live in this world and make sense of it. Our next speaker will be next month in April, and it's Faith and the Good Life. And there is the speaker is coming to us from Loyola University, and the freshman class of philosophy have to ask the same question that he's going to present to us, which is, what is the good life? And how does it have meaning for us in this chapter of life that we all find ourselves in? And so he will be here in April, and we'll have some announcements about that. But today, this is faith and finding common ground through difficult dialogue. And I'm not going to try to cover everything that Anya is going to say today, because she'll set the groundwork just quite wonderfully. But we're really fortunate to have her. She's a part of our community here in Boca Grande, and so she and Greg are in and around and through at this time of year. And I know some of you are playing tennis with them, and some of you are going to dinner with them, but today we get to hear Anya speak. And so I will let her do all of her introductions herself and lay the groundwork for what we will hear. There will be an opportunity for questions after. Please come on up. There'll be questions, an opportunity for questions. We have a brief little reception next door with some wine and goodies if you'd like to talk a little bit more personally following the presentation. And next door is where our bathrooms are. So if you need to make use of those, please just feel free to get up and move accordingly. In school, I used to try to sit down front so that I could pay attention and not be distracted. And it's funny because it's not school, but it feels more like church because you all are sitting that way, which is what we do in church. We sit in the last row, right? So if you can't see, if you can't hear, please feel free to move forward. We are going to record this so that if you have any questions afterwards or if you want to hear it again, that will be available on our website. Okay?
Well, thank you. I think I know so many of you, and I think one of the reasons I know you is my dear, darling husband has everybody we know on Boca Grande. He's like, Anya's giving a talk. I said, please stop. I mean, he's trying to recruit people to come to the talk. I'm Anya Donovan. I'm a professor at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. For many years, I've been there 22 years, I taught undergrad. For a long period of time, I was teaching undergraduates, I was teaching in the medical school, I was directing the Ethics Institute, and teaching in the business school, and hit a near burnout phase by doing and publishing several books and papers like every academic does. And a few years ago, thought seriously about taking early retirement. And again, my dear husband said to me, when you leave some of these jobs, you look downtrodden. When you leave Tuck, our business school, he said, you trip down the stairs and a big smile on your face. So I said, that's a good point. So I'm still teaching at Tuck for a while longer. As Michelle was introducing your next speaker about what is the good life, Loyola, I don't know which Loyola it is. There are many, many Loyolas. Where, do you know, is it Chicago, Los Angeles? Oh, it's Notre Dame. It's that Loyola. It's that Loyola. I would have snagged that topic as well. My training is as a philosopher. My dissertation was on Aristotle, and Aristotle, wrote about everything under the sun. But my very first lecture with my MBA students at the Tuck School of Business, which I will be doing, sadly, in a couple, well, not sadly, I really love doing it, but love being here, but in a couple of weeks when I start teaching, the very first class, I asked them the question, what is a good life? Because that is the Aristotelian question, what is a good life? They almost to a person because they're second-year students, they've spent $200,000 to get an MBA, almost every single one of them says that job with McKinsey, that job with Goldman, that it's about jobs. And I always say, that's one element of a good life, but it's only one element. And it's actually, in the overall scheme of things, not the most important. So I'm going to weave in actually a little bit about what is the good life, because I'm an ethicist, into this question of difficult dialogue. And ethics, just to give you a little bit of background, if you can remember taking maybe when you were a sophomore, you took an introductory philosophy course, the ancient Greeks really nailed the question of the good life, meaning of life, but also about language. So this is where I know, as a young academic, I was always stuck with teaching logic, because you're the new guy. Nobody wants to teach logic. If you ever took a logic class, it's just symbolic calculus. It's not a fun thing to do necessarily. But logic is predicated on the notion of how do we argue? So, some of you are lawyers in the audience. You know that you are giving a premise, and you have to have a good, hearty argument to back up that premise. So I wanted to just when Michelle and I were talking about what might be a good talk, this sounded like a good idea quite a few months ago. As we got closer, I thought, oh my gosh, as I was working on it, I thought, I'm probably going to offend people. And then I thought, I'm probably going to offend everyone, because we're at a point in our society where we're so contentious right now. No matter what you say, people are offended. So, be prepared. I'm going to try to leave plenty of time for discussion. If at any point I'm saying something that you want clarification, please just raise a hand, and I'm happy to have a little more free-flowing. So the history of the United States is viewed as a history of the Enlightenment project. And again, I go back to the fact that, think of when you were in college, and if you took a history of ideas class or a philosophy class, the Enlightenment project is really what set the United States apart from our founding. The Enlightenment project was, the founding fathers were deeply influenced by the revolutionary European notion, and this is the key for everything I'm going to talk about, that truth is not derived from an edict, but from reasoned discourse between people of goodwill. I'm just going to repeat that one time. Truth, which we're all trying to figure out what is truth right now, is derived not from an edict of someone just telling you what to do, but from the reasoned discourse between people of goodwill. That, of course, sounds very simple, but still, it was a radical shift in human consciousness. Think of the Enlightenment, 17th, 18th century, and what was happening before that. And I'm going to briefly just touch on some of those issues. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is lay out some of those principles and share with you some thoughts on whether we can reclaim this elusive idea, and it is very elusive, of reasonable people gathering together to ascertain truth. Indeed, sounds simple, but we are as conflicted on truth today as we were in the 17th and the 18th century. So what was this radical shift that took place in the 17th and 18th century? To define the Enlightenment, it was an emphasis on reason as opposed to simply being told what to believe, and individualism rather than tradition. Prominent exponents were Kant, Voltaire, Rousseau, and Adam Smith. The fact that I teach business ethics, as you can imagine, Adam Smith is probably my favorite out of that whole group, although I like all of them. I always ask my students, my second lecture is on Adam Smith, and I say, what was that? Most of them have heard the name Adam Smith, but when I say, tell me, what was his job? They all say, oh, that's an easy one. He was an economist, moral philosopher. Capitalism is predicated on these Enlightenment notions that Adam Smith put forward, that capitalism is predicated on the goodwill of people, that we have fair exchange of product based on the goodwill of people. The idea, and again, everybody probably has heard of Wealth of Nations. Very few people, maybe all of you, because you're enlightened folks, have heard of his first book, which laid the foundation for Wealth of Nations. It was called Theory of Moral Sentiments. And it was the idea of what are these moral sentiments that we have, and how do we exchange with one another? Adam Smith, if he were here, if we could resurrect him and say, what do you think about people who, not to prejudge, but let's look at the news, Sam Bankman-Fried. If truly he did some fraudulent activity here, Adam Smith would be horrified. Capitalism, in his view, was based on this notion of goodwill between people, that we had a fair exchange, an absolutely fair exchange. So the Enlightenment also was added by things like the printing press. I mean, think about the printing press and how that revolutionized the world. It really, most social historians believe the printing press is what started the Protestant Reformation, not revolution. Well, it's kind of a revolution, but it started the Reformation because suddenly you had the printing press and the Bible was able to be handed to people they could read for themselves. So the printing press, we had the advent of the scientific method happening at the same period of time, an explosion of ideas. And these are all because in the past, prior to the Enlightenment, how did we determine what was true and what wasn't true? Someone told you. It was either a king, a pope, shaman, someone told you what was true, and people said, okay, well, he told me what was true, and it was usually a he told me, so therefore I take it for what it's worth. The Enlightenment changed all of that, and people suddenly said, oh my gosh, maybe we can figure things out for ourselves. So my background, I went to college intending to study science. I really loved chemistry, not so much biology, but I thought, I loved it. And physics, I thought that's really interesting. Took a philosophy class sophomore year and was hooked. I was in college in the late 70s and the early 80s. And one of the things that really influenced me in studying philosophy was that, if anybody can remember, if you were in college at this time, what was happening, the ancient study of truth, justice, and the good life was being rewritten. Fortunately, I had a lot of wonderful professors who were leading me towards Socrates, towards Aristotle, towards Thomas Aquinas. But a lot of people were moving away from that. This was a time of celebrated partisanship. Late 70s, early 80s is when we started down this road. Black studies, women's studies, Chicano studies. I went to school in California. A lot of Chicano studies. We were moving to a highly divided world that has sharply increased in division over the last 40 plus years. And I do pause to say at this point, those divisions were all put in place through good intentions. And Immanuel Kant, another great philosopher of the Enlightenment period, didn't believe in good intentions. He said, where good intentions lead us? It's the path to hell. Good intentions are not sufficient for a good argument and a good society. So we've morphed into a morass of cultural relativism and partisan ideology. And again, all of this has come about, it was leading up, but we've had an explosion within the last 50 years. I want to give you just a couple of examples of where we have this divide of dialogue. In 2015, you may have read this, and it was in everywhere, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal. Erica Christakis was the co-master at Silliman College at Yale. And she wrote, anybody raise a hand, remember what happened at Yale in 2015 with Erica Christakis? No, good, I'll give you a good story then. You'll enjoy this one. She was the master of the house. Can't say master any longer, and I'll get to that later, but she and her husband were the masters of the house of Silliman College. Halloween was coming up. Students were in a bit of a dither about Halloween. Erica sent an email out to the students and said, let's calm down. It's Halloween, folks. You're Yale students. Be adults. Do whatever you want to do. Anybody know what happened to Erica Christakis? Out. She was fired because it was viewed as inappropriate language to send to students. I'm going to go back to that one. But even the Atlantic Monthly, which is not a conservative magazine, the Atlantic Monthly described her message as a model of relevant, thoughtful, civil engagement. To no avail. She was still fired. She defended her actions, saying, a culture of protection may ultimately harm those it purports to protect. I must say, one of the things that's delightful about the horrible thing that happened to Erica is she moved to Hanover, New Hampshire with her husband, so she's in our Episcopal church in Hanover. Delightful person. Another one, very recent, January 2023, University of North Carolina Board of Trustees voted to establish a new school, I'm sure some of you have read about this, committed to free expression in higher education. The School of Civic Life and Leadership has as its primary goal the ending of political constraints on what can be taught in university classes. Very simple concept. They said, let's just have one school where it's just plain and simple, students can just learn concepts. The new school will adhere, they said, to University of Chicago's free expression principles. The University of Chicago is one of the few schools in this country that adamantly adheres to free expression principles, meaning you can say whatever you want to say. Board Vice Chair John Pryor explained the U.S. post-secondary education was once a great cultural and competitive advantage, but it has deteriorated as progressive views and woke politics have taken over schools and departments. Voicing his opinion, within 2 days of the announcements, the faculty at UNC voted overwhelmingly strong dissent and objected to the new school, and the future looks extremely doubtful for this new school at University of North Carolina. Another one, Wall Street Journal in February of 2023, just recently, the beginning of this month, ran an op-ed, some of you may have read this, on the search committee at Texas Tech University. They were looking for biology professors, and the candidates that came in were screened. The very first question that they were asked, without any background, so they were just asked, explain to us the difference between equity and equality. Now, that's an interesting concept, but if you're a biology professor, is it really the necessary thing that you need? If they used, and the score sheet was leaked, I think, to reporters. If they used inclusive pronouns, they were praised. If they made a land acknowledgement, which is a new thing in higher education, they were praised, meaning before you can even start to speak, you have to acknowledge this land was once fill in the blank, whoever lived there, whatever Native American tribe lived there. The result is that anyone in this school, this situation that veered from DEI orthodoxy, was not given a job. They weren't even brought back for a second interview. In my own area of rural New England, northern New England, we had a principal of a small school, the town, 2 towns down from us, who posted on her Facebook page that after George Floyd, she said she supported, and again, it was her personal Facebook page, which does lead me to the idea maybe people, if you don't want to get into trouble, don't have a Facebook page. But she posted that she supports all efforts to reduce racism. She's a white woman. Almost everybody in northern New Hampshire is white, I should point out. White woman. She said she supported every effort to reduce racism, but she also supported Blue Lives Matter. 2 days later, she was fired. She won a very small settlement, but she cannot find another job. I think she was doing something, she had moved to Maine, she was trying to do some online kind of business, but because of the notoriety of the case, she can't even get any interviews. These are but a few cases within my own area of expertise, higher education and education, but we are continually bombarded with judgments over statements and comments that we make. Language is not precise. As human beings, we are constantly evolving in our language. It's the nature of the species. That's what we do. The human brain is an amazing machine that categorizes, judges, files away. We use language to make sense of the world. And yes, words definitely matter. I was someplace recently in a waiting room, actually at our hospital. I just had a checkup, and I heard 2 men talking, and they were interesting language, but one kept talking about ice fishing, and he kept using the phrase, my old lady, really, it bothers her when I go ice fishing, and then he kept talking about my old lady, and I thought, boy, an entire value structure comes out just by the fact that instead of saying, my beloved wife doesn't like when I spend the whole day ice fishing, it was, my old lady crabs at me, as I'm ice fishing. Words do matter, the words that we choose to categorize people. But our attempt at inclusivity has resulted in absolute, in my opinion, mass confusion. Stanford's recent attempt to eliminate offensive language, again, good intentions, best of intentions, the idea that we don't want to offend people. Field is no longer, according to Stanford, should never be used because field may make someone think of slavery and people working in fields. So, and in academia, we say there's a field of study. If you're a philosophy major, what's your field? You would always ask people, meaning, are you an ethicist, epistemology? What is your field? So at Stanford, you can no longer use field. Master, no longer use master. Had nothing to do with slavery, by the way, folks. It had to do with an educational system that's very ancient, but you can't use master. You can't use the in front of any category at Stanford. And the one that was, if you recall, this is just recent, the one that was most poked at and made fun of was the French. They use this example. That's very offensive to say the French. You have to say people of French origin or something. I think for most of us, we saw the silliness of this. Then we get to the ridiculous. People who have uteruses. You can't say woman. You have to say people who have uteruses. You can't say breastfeeding. People who chest feed. All of these, again, good intentions, but I think for most people of goodwill, they're ridiculous. It's absolutely absurd to say people who have uteruses. Well, what about somebody who doesn't have, somebody who has a hysterectomy? Is she no longer a woman? I mean, this is just, again, we have to clarify where our language goes. Note that all of these examples, and I may be judged as too generous in my assumption here, are grounded in this notion of people not wanting to offend. This is where we are in contemporary American society, not wanting to offend. And we have a long tradition of this notion of wanting to offend in language. And because we're all here in this wonderful, beautiful church that we love, the Episcopal Church, let me just give you an example from the book of Genesis, Tower of Babel. It's the classic example of the descendants of Noah building the tower to heaven and offending God. Why? I'll just give you, it's just a short quote from Scripture. Look, they are one people. They have one language. This is only the beginning. Let their language be confused so they will not understand one another's speech. Babel is contemporary America. We have confused our speech so that we cannot understand one another. People speaking in different kinds of ways, making absolutely snap judgments about what they mean when they speak. Babel is kind of a metaphor. We're disoriented, we don't speak the same language, we don't recognize truth, and we're cut off from the past because everyone has their own truth. Relativism, I ask my students all of the time, is there any universal truth? When I started teaching, I would get most of them saying there were a few things, a handful of things that they would say, yes, these are universal truths. My students now, almost to a person, say, absolutely not. And I say, well, how do we determine what's true? It depends on what I think. You think one thing, I think another, they think something else. We're in trouble if that is the case, that everything is relativistic. Red and blue America are quite distinct. We have different constitutions, we have different economics, and I'm talking about the far extremes. We have different American history. What's the result of that? Massive fragmentation. And how did this happen? How do we come to this? The interesting thing is, if you study my area in, actually was a combined degree, it's ethics, but also I did a lot of work in moral psychology, and I continue to. Biology shows us that the human species tends towards cooperation. That is a fact. We tend toward cooperation. Why do we do that? To survive. If any of you ever read Thomas Hobbes, the great English philosopher, he was a fascinating guy, and he said he believed firmly, you can agree or disagree with this, he talked about the state of nature. If we just had human beings on their own, what would they be like? He said it's three things. And if you remember, little test for the memory here, if you studied political philosophy, three things. I was a professor at the Naval Academy. My midshipmen loved Thomas Hobbes. It's nasty, it's brutish, and it's short. Because all we want to do is kill one another, rape, and pillage. So why don't we go and do that? Hobbes said, because we're smart, because of this power of reason, we know if we do it, we're just all doomed, that we just have killed each other. So we do this funny thing called a social contract. And we build a social contract, say, okay, I won't steal from you, you don't steal from me. I don't really like it because I would love to steal from you. Your stuff is much more shiny than my stuff, but I'm not going to. I'll abide by the rules. The social contract sets some parameters for this. But what happened? Social contract worked really well. Again, Hobbes is kind of that Enlightenment period. I'm going to make a bold statement here. The invention of the internet has changed everything in the world, everything, and for the good. So I'm not saying necessarily bad. So the invention of the internet in the 1990s changed human interaction profoundly. I don't have to point this out to you. All you have to do, I just noticed this morning, I went down to get coffee. No, I didn't. I'm lying. Greg gets coffee every morning. I went downstairs. I lay in bed, and my dear husband brings coffee up. But I went downstairs, and I just noticed in the beautiful common room at the inn, every single person was on their phone. Every single person. When we started coming here, it wasn't even that long ago, 7 years ago, people would chat. They'd just stop and they would chat. Everybody was just this. That's the invention of the internet. By 2003, it was developed in the 1990s. By 2003, we had MySpace, I don't even think that's around anymore, Friendster, and Facebook. Facebook in particular is interesting because the idea was mass communication. If you probably saw the film about Facebook, but Mark Zuckerberg took that from Phillips Exeter Academy. My son was a classmate of his. I'm like, you couldn't think of going to work with Mark Zuckerberg? He's like, no, I didn't. But Facebook was actually an Exeter thing, and then Harvard also had a similar kind of Facebook. The idea they had was that people could just connect, and the internet was there, so it seemed like a great idea. 2008, Facebook had 100 million users. Anybody take a guess how many users are on Facebook? And our kids are not using Facebook now. We're all using Facebook. But anybody guess how many users there are in Facebook? 3 billion with a B, 3 billion people. And as soon as parents started using it, all the kids stopped using it because my mom is on Facebook. No, I'm not going to be on it. So the initial assessment of the internet was that this was going to be a boon to democracy. We have brought down information. Everybody is able to communicate with one another. This is going to be wonderful. 2011, here's where the hope came in. If you recall what happened in 2011, the Arab Spring. Guess why the Arab Spring happened? The internet. It was the ability of people to come together and say, I think we can do this. That was terrific. It was great for people to actually be able to say, we're going to pull off the shackles of tyranny and we're going to live a life. Didn't work so well later. Google Translate happened at the same time, 2011. Anybody use Google Translate? I don't actually use it, but you can just put in there, and all of a sudden, so we've reversed Tower of Babel, right? You can figure out language that people have. So why wasn't there unity? We had this great idea, bringing all these people together. Well, historically, civilization has relied on three things for unity. I'm reducing, but three things for unity. One, shared blood, meaning we were kin. Shared blood. Two, gods. I don't care where you are, people have some religious orientation. The most primitive tribe to, the most sophisticated. Gods. Three, enemies. It's a shared concept. We're the good guys. Those guys, they're really awful. I went to Tanzania a few years ago, and I remember saying, I was just trying to compliment the people, which it wasn't false, how lovely and hospitable the people were. And they said, oh, thank you. Yes, we know. Don't go to Nigeria. They're awful over there. And I thought, this is the whole idea of who's your enemy, pulling us together. But what binds democracy? So these are the things that bind civilizations. What binds democracies? Number one, social capital. Social capital, primarily things like trust. This would be a whole separate, I do 2 sections in my ethics class with MBA students about trust. There's a barometer of trust, and we're constantly gauging and surveying people about who's trusted. We're losing trust in all entities in the United States right now, and it's really essential for democracy, really essential. We were just talking a few minutes ago, something that somebody's going to bring up during Q&A about journalists. Journalists used to be, they were very high on the list of trusted professions in the United States. It's really reduced right now for a variety of reasons that they're not. Strong institutions, the second thing, strong institutions, banks, universities, hospitals, all of those. And third, shared stories. This is really important for democracy, shared stories. So if you go back, and again, because I'm an Aristotelian, Aristotle, who was promoting a very different kind of democracy, but he was promoting democracy, but he wrote 2 books on moral education. They were targeted to children. And he said, the way you build a democracy is you start with infants. And with those infants, you train them through things like stories of their ancestors, pride in their institution. He was big on parades. He thought music was really good. All of these things were really critically important for building democratic citizenship. I did a project a long time ago on 19th century American moral education. And I was really fascinated to see, how, we can't replicate this, but it's an interesting historical point. In the 19th century, we had mass immigration into this country, but different kinds of immigration, right? It was I'm Irish, half English, but the Irish were coming, the Germans, people from China, they were coming flooding into this country because of the Industrial Revolution. The people in power said, we need the workers, but oh my gosh, they don't even speak our language. What do we do with them? And they eat funny food. They said, public schools. That's the way we get them. So they taught them English. There was a wonderful little book. Well, wonderful might be pejorative, but I think it's a really interesting little book, McGuffey's Readers. And they were prolific in the 19th century where kids learned to read. And if you look at a McGuffey's Reader, they're little snippets of scripture, they're Aesop's fables. What were they teaching? Responsibility, hard work, patriotism. Those are the shared stories. So where are we now with shared stories? I'll leave that for Q&A, but we're really fractured on the shared stories that we have for children. Social media has weakened almost all of them. We went from, in social media, benign postings, cats, people were posting pictures of their cats or their kids, to now things like performative actions. That does not bind community together. So 2 things happen in social media that really changed the internet: the like button and the share button. And as soon as those 2 things happened, it no longer became simply communicating with one another. It was all about performative. And we've all seen this, right? No matter where you go and you see somebody just doing this pose where they're looking fetchingly and they have their camera so that they want a picture so they can post it. That's not saying, oh my gosh, I'm at the Louvre. I've wanted my whole life to go here. I want to share with my friends. Can you believe I'm here? No, it's just don't I look great in front of the Louvre? So it's performative rather than informative. So for most people, those posts, the like and the share, are the ones that trigger emotions, especially anger at groups. We've moved into anger at groups. By 2013, there was a new concept in the internet, brand new concept, go viral. And go viral became a thing, and it was almost always emotionally charged. So for something to go viral, it was not you saying, oh my gosh, I just read the most uplifting book, it was great. No, that's not going to go viral. It has to be something incendiary. So this is exactly what James Madison tried to avoid. If you read the Federalist number 10, he said, while he was drafting the Constitution, this is how brilliant these men were who were drafting the Constitution. He said, democracy depends upon, quote, collective judgment of the people, and it is subject to unruly passions. Therefore, he went on to say later in Federalist number 10, a sustainable republic must build in mechanisms for slowing things down. You have to always slow them down. We are rapidly increasing. There's no slowing down. So the minute something is posted, there's a response. Madison anticipated not the internet, but he knew human nature, that we tend towards this notion of unruly passions. And when citizens lose trust, every decision becomes contested, every single decision. So all we're doing is this right now. It's interesting, too, just as a side note, there was an international study of citizens' trust in government. Business media showed China, who had the highest levels of trust. Now, I'm not saying these are worthy of trust, but worldwide, who has the highest level of trust? China, United Arab Emirates, top 2 for trust. Who has the lowest trust? Now, again, for a variety of reasons. Lowest trust, number 1, US, number 2, UK, number 3, Spain, number 4, South Korea. Lowest level of trust. Citizens do not trust the people within their government. That's a bad sign. Madison would be very upset with that poll. So what does polarization do to us? As a community, there was a 2018 study that found deep, unprecedented divisions, and there's a spectrum of what people believe. On one end of the spectrum, the most devoted conservative are 6% of the population. So it's not 6%. It's good, it's a significant number, but it's not like half the population. Devoted conservative. Way on the other end of the spectrum, progressives, progressive activists, not just progressive activists, 8% of the population. Here's the interesting thing that came out of that study. Both of those groups, after they did the survey, because they had a lot of information, incredibly white and the wealthiest strata in the United States out of those 2 groups. So that's interesting because those are the noisiest groups. And they're fighting with one another. Anyone who expresses sympathy in either of those groups for the other side, woe to you. You will get backlash from your own cohort. You're not allowed to say anything sympathetic about other people. But when the public square is governed by mob dynamics, unrestrained by due process, we lose both justice and inclusion. A major outgrowth of the internet is this notion of confirmation bias. So if you've never heard of this notion, confirmation bias is where you search only for evidence that confirms your own preferred beliefs. And I would say, again, we'll talk a little bit about journalism, but if you talk to some people where they say, what news do you watch on TV? You can tell immediately what someone's beliefs are. They'll say, I only watch Fox News because that's the only good news. I only watch MSNBC because that's the only logical news there is. Well, you can tell immediately what the orientation is. I always ask, well, have you watched the other? And they look at you like you grew a second head. It's like, well, why would I ever watch that other news? We get both Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. I always tell and then our local paper. A lot of newspapers in our house. But I always ask my students about newspapers, and they say, well, I wouldn't read both of them. It's really important to read multiple sources of news in order to have this balance that you can figure out in your own head. So can this be cured? I always go a little long here. I want to leave plenty of time to talk about it. Can it be cured? Yes. But honest dialogue with different views is difficult. I'll quote John Stuart Mill, the wonderful English philosopher. I think probably his best book was On Liberty, where he was trying to figure out this question of how do we keep this, and England was a mess when John Stuart Mill was writing, but he said he was trying to figure out how do we keep the avenues open of communication. He has a great quote. He said, "He who knows only his own side of the case knows very little at that." It's true. If we don't look at the other person empathetically and listen, just zip it, listen to the other side, you cannot come to a point of truth. And again, if you're listening to someone just with hurry up, finish your thought so I can slam you and tell you how wrong you are, you can never get to the point of truth. Having taught logic and teaching ethics, my students often, when I try to explain to them how we can take really difficult concepts, and abortion, probably the best one, it's so controversial. And I cannot get students to really talk about abortion now because they're so afraid of peer judgment on their perspectives. I was just telling some dear friends the other night about a situation I had during the Kavanaugh hearings. And on Monday, I like teaching early classes. So Monday morning at 8 o'clock, my students, these are MBA students, they're adults. They came in, and we always get there early, and they're coming in with their coffee and their oatmeal and talking about ski trips and weddings and, anything else they're doing. And they're always chitty-chatty. And I said, anybody follow the Kavanaugh hearings? Boom, there was suddenly a silence. You could hear a pin drop. And one young woman looked at me horrified, and she said, Professor Donovan, that's really inappropriate for you to ask. And I thought, wow, to me, it's one of the most appropriate things because Kavanaugh basically was in a job interview. My students are going into business. They have job interviews. Is it okay that we look at somebody's high school yearbook? That's a legitimate question. But they were so afraid to say anything because judgment would be passed. Silence is not a good avenue for democracy. It's not a good avenue for business. It's certainly not good for us just as human beings. Just the other day, we were driving over to, here on the island, and Greg and I were listening to NPR. There was a fascinating story. I don't know if anybody heard it, but the story was about reporters at the New York Times who were doing research, and they wanted to do a story about gender dysphoria and whether there should be some caution put about kids and gender issues. The newsroom had turned against these reporters. One of them censured. We're talking about that they shouldn't even be at the New York Times because they have said, and so one of the other reporters said, well, what is the issue? And they said, well, maybe somebody in their family is going through this and that would offend them. Again, I go back to the point of offend, and that would offend them. Therefore, they are not worthy to be a reporter at the New York Times. The role of a reporter is to put all the information out there, the ugly, the pleasant, to put it all out there and say, we're just here serving it up to you. Now you figure out, based on your own values and your own principles, what you believe about this. So that's just one of the professions that's under challenge right now. Punishment for challenging a view is both public shaming and social death. So if you put a contrary position out there, you are in danger of one of those two things. Another example, the journalist David Shore retweeted a study. This is a study he found, he's a journalist, after the George Floyd incident, and he was trying to show that violent black protests in the 60s led to electoral setbacks for Democrats. Objective statement. He was not saying he was just saying, this is an interesting point. He was fired, and he was deemed anti-black, and he cannot get another job. Again, that's simply a fact that was put out there. So what are the solutions? Number one, strengthening democratic institutions, that people feel good about our democratic institutions. Number two, reforming social media. We just saw something, you probably all did too, the Wall Street Journal, I think it was yesterday, or maybe it was this morning, has a new feature that you can eliminate pornographic pictures. 15-year-olds are sending a lot of naughty pictures of themselves. It's a great invention. I said, this person should win a prize, that they've done something that kids, because there was just a case recently of a 15-year-old boy was in communication with someone he thought was a 15-year-old girl. He sent a nude picture of his genitalia. It was a group of other boys. They taunted him. He committed suicide. This is a horrible, horrible, we know kids are really vulnerable at this point. The third solution area is education. Anxiety and depression are at all times high, and again, a lot of this is due to social media. 1 in 3, again, another study, 1 in 3 16-year-old girls has considered suicide. 1 in 3. That is the most shocking number I have come across in ages. Universities now forbid opposing speakers. There's just all sorts of things going on. We're seeing a rise in different kinds of educational endeavors where parents are, rightly so, trying to shelter their kids to give them some kind of freedom. But one of the things that they really need to do is think about, what are the values that are associated there? So the words that we use, and I'll just kind of end with this. There's, again, this project I did on 19th century moral education. One of the things I came across was every major university in the United States in the 19th century had a capstone course. And most of them were for men. The capstone, like Yale, Dartmouth, the capstone course was philosophy, religion, political leadership, but it was also civic engagement. The rules of civility. Michelle and I were just talking. I said, the simplest little book that I've ever come across that is just chock full of wisdom was George Washington's Rules of Civility. It is a fantastic book. He was the model of civility. It goes a long way. And when you have civility, you get defenses broken down, that people are able to talk to one another, that they sense that maybe you're a good person as well. Again, I go back to those, what constitutes a society, enemies. We think everybody's an enemy in the United States rather than thinking we're all cohesively together. So I conclude with the fact, two things. This is my personal opinion. Some people may disagree. The human spirit bends toward good. We bend toward good. We really, we like to be kind to people. We like people to show kindness to us. We bend towards the good. Secondly, the way that we understand that good, because most of us are followers. I don't care what anybody says about leadership. Most of us are followers. We need moral leadership. I'll just give one partisan thing. I think Jimmy Carter had serious deficiencies as a president, but if you read the Peggy Noonan op-ed about him, it was just a brilliant piece about a person who just has tried to be good. He's the best post-president we've ever had, because he's just out building houses and just trying to do good things in the world. That's moral leadership, and it's probably, we are in short supply of it right now. So the language issue is simply, I put this as discourse, but it's just an indicator of how we tamp things down to get back to that notion of civility and bring us together. So I went a little longer than I wanted to, but I really wanted to open this up to the idea of what you think about these issues and where you are with it. Oh, thank you.
ethics, what do you use as a foundation?
Well, so in my teaching at Dartmouth College, I use Aristotle. Personally, just as a human being, I very much love, I was trained by Jesuits. I love Thomas Aquinas, and I think, Thomas Aquinas was called, he called Aristotle, or he called himself a baptized Aristotelian. So, if you blend the two of those together, Aristotle was really interesting, but again, we're a secular school, Dartmouth College, so I certainly don't talk about God there. But for me, as a person, I believe in God, and I believe in human nature. I think there is something about natural law that kind of binds us together. So I love those two kind of coming together. I love reading about any kind of ethical orientation, though. I think there are wrong ways to look at the world. I think that when I was in graduate school, in particular, the whole French movement of Derrida and Foucault were really big, and they are complete nihilists. It's like, there is no God, there's no meaning to life, so screw it, who cares? That is not my orientation. But some people really believe it. Jean-Paul Sartre, Samuel Beckett, all of his plays, if anybody's seen Waiting for Godot, it's all about nihilism. It's just the world sucks, and you just muddle through and then you die. Wow, thank you, that's uplifting. So I think there's more to it. Come on, I want your question. We were talking ahead of time.
Jerry, I'm right behind you.
You started off by talking about truth and the pursuit of truth. In the media this week, there's been lots of attention given to the fact that officials at Fox News privately said one thing and then publicly told their audiences something quite different. So could you pick up on that a little bit in terms of how do we try to foster the pursuit of truth when you have officials who clearly are not following that doctrine?
Right. I think it's a great question. And again, I did touch a little bit on just the notion of professions. And in my classes, I do a whole section about, what do we mean by professionalism? And I use, again, the Aristotelian, what are the virtues of different professions? So like for a physician, what's the virtue for a physician? Do no harm. That kind of guides everything that you do in your professional life. What's the virtue for, if you're a lawyer, it's the pursuit of justice, at all costs. I mean, I remember people saying, why would someone, take on a client that, some scummy person they know is guilty? Because it's the system we have that says you're entitled to a trial. We have this marvelous thing called you're innocent until you go to trial, and then a jury determines. What's the virtue for journalists? It's truth. The fact that if people are really spreading untruth, that's not journalism. It's not journalism at all. It's something else. It's persuasive tactics to try to get people to believe something. Journalism, somebody, I forget who it was, I was just reading something recently about someone who was an old school journalist, and he hates the term journalist. He said, I'm a newspaper man. And newspaper man has a different ring to it. Newspaper man, and he meant man, he was an older guy, because they just went out and they got the truth and let the cards fall where they may. I mean, again, we'll see what happens with all of this, but any profession. If you look at what happened to the financial services after the debacle in financial services, the trust level just plummeted. There's a quote that I often use with my students from Warren Buffett. I just think it's a brilliant quote. It takes a lifetime to build a reputation. A lifetime. It takes 5 minutes to lose it. All you have to do is one decision. Your whole life, boom, gone. And I think, for a lot of people in a profession, they haven't been imbued with that sense of, what are the values for me as a professional? I mean, everything from the clothes that we wear. One of the things I love about Tuck, our business school, all of the professors dress really nice. Men all wear a jacket. Some don't wear a tie, but they all at least have a jacket on. And I think that shows to me, when I go into a classroom, I show up on time, their papers are graded on time, I'm showing them the respect that I give to them by the profession that I'm in. And I sure as heck expect reciprocity, that they had better treat me the same way. They better not be cheating. I mean, I'm hardcore. Somebody doesn't abide by the rules, boom, you're out. I was talking to somebody about rules, and kids and learning rules. This was another Aristotelian thing. It was also Piaget, the great Swiss psychologist. He said, how do we learn ethics? How do we learn? By rules. And he said, how do you teach kids? And he had this, I think he wrote 2 books on marbles. Nobody even plays marbles anymore. But he used marbles because marbles, if you recall, are kind of, people make their own rules up about marbles. But he said it's all about how you play the game, and if you cheat, if you don't cheat, how people let you know. And for children today, I'm going to rant here a bit, but I think the thing of everybody getting the trophy for, showing up is, it just flies in the face of what Piaget was saying. It flies in the face of what Aristotle was saying. One of the best lessons in life is learning how to graciously lose, that you can, grit your teeth and say, well done. But it's really important for kids to learn that, and they're really not learning that particularly now. So the professions are really struggling right now with values. Every profession is. It's not just journalists. Every profession. I mean, at our medical school at Dartmouth, there was a huge debate. The white coat ceremony was viewed as patriarchal and blah, 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 blah. So everybody's trying to figure out how we move into the new world. Again, trying not to offend, but in effect, offending everyone by trying not to offend. Is there anything else? Any other? Oh.
I believe our founding fathers were believers in God.
Yes.
I remember Adam on his day before he died, rejoice evermore.
Yeah.
So there's something gracious about that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's more than that, it is collaborative. And I just feel that we're missing this God spirit. Spirit's wild,
Yeah.
but we have everything if we just realize that God has to be at the center. And for those of us who truly believe that in our professions, I'm not as bothered by the bad news that I feel the country in your delivery. I want to say rejoice evermore. I want to just believe that our capacity can be expanded to do these things if God's at our center.
Yeah.
Sure.
And I think your point is so well taken, because if somebody, why do you do what you do, like in your profession or, whatever you do in your life? And if you're doing it because you're motivated by your own spiritual awareness, it's a very different way to view the world than if it's like, it's all about me. And again, my selfies and, aren't I great? Who likes an egotist? You can smell them a mile away, and they're just obnoxious, So somebody who really can, when I have something really difficult to do, I was raised Roman Catholic, so I usually kind of do a little prayer to Mary, please, help me here, because this is not about me. This is about whatever it is. If it's, where I'm going to do some presentation at the medical school or something, it's about, fostering awareness. That's a very different orientation than saying, oh, I'm so important, and isn't it great I'm doing this? So I agree with you completely. How do you foster that? Most people won't even extend themselves to say, it's a fine line. How do you invite someone into a faith community? Because people might be offended. I still think it's a good thing to do, to invite people. So
as a country and as a world, how do we move forward, and how do we get out of this mess?
Yeah, so I just gave a couple of quick, I'm running for office, so no. I do think part of it is political leadership, but it's just leadership. It's not just political leadership, it's moral leadership, that people can stand up and say, this isn't right, or, well, let me challenge you on this position or something. The fact that you can't have a conversation where, I feel like I'm always having to explain that, well, I'm not a fill in the blank something, but, I think you shouldn't have to do that. You should be able to just simply, give an opinion on something. So a lot of it is us. It's not just, the President of the United States. It's us, challenging someone when they make a statement that's absolutely egregious, to say, I don't actually agree with that. Instead, most of us it's like somebody saying a joke that's really offensive, and you just think, oh, boy, what a jerk, but you don't say anything. It's probably a good idea to politely, but firmly say, that's actually not really funny to me. I'm sure you didn't mean it this way, but it's actually not funny to me. So I think little things we can do as well as big things.
There was something that, when you were talking about Warren Buffett and 5 minutes to lose your reputation, and one of the things that I see is forgiveness is just not there.
Absolutely.
We are all human beings.
Couldn't agree
and
more.
we are going to make mistakes.
Yep.
And forgiveness is not possible. So if you've made a mistake, if we made a mistake with the original sin of slavery, if there's no coming back from that,
Right.
where do we go from there?
We're doomed.
Yeah.
Then we're doomed. I do, one of my sections in my class is actually, I use the Lance Armstrong case study, which is getting a little dated now, but one of the reason I use it is that it's illustrative to just your point about forgiveness, because he went on Oprah Winfrey and said, I did take drugs, and I cheated, and you can see even in his body language he wasn't really terribly sorry. So it opens up this great discussion with my students about forgiveness, because if if someone does something wrong, they should definitely be punished, whatever that is, just punishment. But in moral thought, especially in retributive justice, there's an idea that you bring people back. So if anybody's done anything in the legal field, we don't just send people to prison and say, good, they're out of our hair, may they rot forevermore. We have wonderful facilities. I mean, Greg and I go to one where we cook dinner at a Dismiss house, where recently incarcerated young men are coming. They are rough characters, but they're getting jobs at Home Depot and they're getting jobs at the hardware store, and they're trying to get their lives together. We have more to do for them, to say, you said I'm sorry, you paid the price, and now we say, let's start anew. That's an essential component of forgiveness. But boy, we are not doing that now. So the minute, and we don't even wait for somebody to be determined if they actually committed the crime. It's just like you've lost your job, you're out. So these are really tough times, really tough times. I mean, we all joke at Dartmouth, geez, can we make it to retirement without getting, penalized by the dean for saying something wrong? Because you just don't know. Nobody jokes anymore. I used to say to my students all the time if they had interviews, which they're interviewing with big companies, and the guys would come in who usually look like slobs with, a nice jacket on, and I'd say, wow, you clean up well. I'm never saying that again, because I know I will get, and they would laugh, but I think you just can't do stuff like that anymore. But I think it's, in moral psychology, it's one of the most important points. Even just in our families, when somebody screws up, how readily do we forgive them, and do we say, that's done. We've covered it, you've apologized, I've forgiven, it's not to be talked about again. No, people are like, you remember 5 years ago? That's bad when you're doing that kind of thing. I think we have time for a couple more.
When you mentioned the unified countries, such as China and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, and not for good reason, but they
Right.
do have high trust.
Well, I think they have such high trust and they're so unified because they are indoctrinated.
Well, authoritarian.
Yes.
Yes.
And in the United States, there are so many splintered groups, and they're also stubborn that I don't think I don't know how unifying or how unified we could get. I keep praying for that the times will create the leader like a Washington or a Madison. And I look at that as something that I hope and pray for, and I believe that will happen here.
Yeah. And in the past, the United States was very high on the trust survey. We were actually very high. So we have deteriorated, and it's because of that fracturization. Austin, I'm sure you have a tough question for me.
Anya, I loved your presentation.
Oh, thanks, Austin. You have to say that because you're my friend.
I am, friend. I'm so admiring of you. Love history, and historically, this country's going through some really rough periods. The Revolutionary War was the country was divided in the beginning, and then putting together a government was a really tough thing, contentious. I don't know how it could get any worse than the Civil War, which just awful, and the Vietnam War. Yeah. And yet, I worry about, everybody says this country's in big trouble, and I do believe in so many respects it is, but yet somebody referred to the goodness that I see, and I do see an enormous amount of goodness in this country, people trying to help and people worried about the problems and want to get back to a better balance.
Yeah.
So my question is, we've gone through these really rough times, I think much rougher than we're going through now, frankly.
Yeah.
Historically, jeopardizing the nation itself. What do you, how does this?
Yeah,
how does this
I just think it's a great point. That's why I said, at the conclusion, I believe very strongly that the human spirit bends toward the good. And I've never, when I say I teach ethics at a business school, I almost always get, some flippant response like, oh, good luck, or they need it. And I always say, I've never once in 22 years had a student come in and say, I can't wait to just screw everybody over and, have the perp walk and be on the front page of the New York Times. To a person, my students really want to do good in the world. They want to make money, make no mistake. But they want to do good in the world. So they're trying to figure out, sustainable products. On their off time, they go to Africa to build generators so that people can have electricity. They're doing really good things in the world. So I agree with you. I think we can get battened down. And again, part of this is we're on a 24-hour news cycle. When most of us were kids, you had an evening paper. That was it. Like the evening news, maybe, that your family put on the TV. We're just bombarded with news. If you watch, and again, this is not partisan, whether it's CNN or Fox, if whatever's happening, it's just 24/7. It's like, oh my gosh, the Palestine, Ohio, it's just like, they just can't, and it's horrible, but it's, what does that do to your brain if you just are constantly bombarded? And it's never good stuff. It's always negative stuff. So, we probably need to promote those. And again, I take great hope in kids. I think that this is a separate issue altogether because I'm passionate about education. I think we have done dastardly things to young people in this country during the last few years where they've absolutely lost several years of school that they're now saying can never be recaptured. And the only avenue in a capitalist democracy to succeed is education. And so and who are those kids? They're almost all kids of color. So the wealthy kids had tutors, they had, the private schools stayed open, public schools closed, and it was like, oh, they'll be fine because no, those kids are falling through the cracks, and that's really a challenge for us as a nation.
So, unless there's another burning question, we had a speaker at our women's breakfast, Kathy Lewis, maybe at the end of January, beginning of February. And she is a television personality at one time and commentator from Richmond, Virginia. And on this question about finding common ground through difficult dialogue, the thing that she said, because she would always get these barbs coming at her, is, tell me why or how you came to think that way.
Yeah.
And it's one of the most disarming questions that I've been thinking about over these last 2 months is if I radically disagree with somebody or if I'm taken off guard, instead of just going head to head, and especially with our children who have such a different way of thinking than we were raised with, to simply ask that question, tell me more, tell me how you came to think that way, because it respects the person standing in front of you and helps you to learn a little bit more. And so,
great
Anya,
point.
You have carried that thought through your presentation today.
Well,
and
great.
So thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you very much. Thank you.
If you would like just a few more moments with her, we're going to have a little reception next door. If you are going to go on your way, go with God and with blessings on your afternoon. Otherwise, there's some wine and some water and some refreshments next door. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.